We're all very human and fallible, and yet we live in a society that rewards pretending we're not fallible, or the range of acceptable fallibility is narrow.
We are constantly comparing our insides to other people's outsides and feeling inadequate and guilty, even ashamed.
Trying to blend in means parts of ourselves must disappear, and we must then live in fear that we will be found out.
Here, together, we will create a space where we can laugh, cry, and carry our suffering and hurts lightly.
In the service of being deeply human.
This is Life's Dirty Little Secrets. Hello, and welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets. I'm Chris McCurry.
And I'm Emma Waddington. And today we're doing an episode, just Chris and I, to talk about anxious parents and anxious children. We felt this is a really important conversation and topic. We know many people who are anxious. We ourselves have moments of anxiety. I especially do as a parent. And we were hoping to shed some light on, perhaps how we can relate to anxiety differently, how we can think about our parenting, and how we can support our anxious children. Perhaps we can kick off thinking firstly about what is anxiety and really how normal it is and why is it so common? Why is anxiety so common? And maybe, Chris, you can kick off with that.
Well, I would start by just going back to what you were saying a moment ago. Parenting is the most anxiety-provoking thing I've ever done in my life.
It really is.
And will be forever. Because even though my child is now 30, he still gives me lots of opportunities to be anxious about him, whether they're realistic or not. But, anxiety is so prevalent because we are all the descendants of the paranoid people. It's sort of baked into our evolution as a species because all the complacent, non-anxious people got eaten before they reached reproductive age. And so, every one of our ancestors got by and survived by being a little bit paranoid, and it worked. Unfortunately, so much of society today is, we're recording this as Los Angeles is burning. So I can't say that, we live in an anxiety-free world. Obviously, we don't. There's a lot to be anxious about. And with media and social media, it just gets pushed into our faces all the time. And our kids are dealing with this, and there's a lot of pressure on kids. So anxiety as well as depression have increased in youth in the last couple of decades. And that's not just an artifact of being better at assessing these things and having more knowledge about them and awareness of them. Things really are, heating up in terms of the stress that people are under, and it's showing up in all these different ways.
And that's despite the fact that we live in a safer world than we did, maybe not 20 years ago, but certainly 50 years ago. Despite that, we're still getting more and more anxious.
Yeah, it's an epidemic.
Really is. And how do we make sense of that? How do we make sense of the fact that we are getting more and more anxious, both as parents and children?
Well, I think we make sense of it in terms of recognizing that there is so much to be anxious about, and that it really is part of the deal. When you sign on to be a parent, we may not have read the fine print, but it was there that, here's your child, here's your anxiety. I think I mentioned on one of our podcasts before, is like, they don't let you leave the hospital without having an appropriate car seat for your child, and they also hand you this bag of anxiety along with it. So I think sort of normalizing it in a sense. My father was what they used to call an efficiency expert and solved problems within companies. And he used to talk about the difference between problems and conditions. And he said a problem is a situation you don't like, and you look around, you solve the problem by applying some solutions. A condition, on the other hand, is a situation you don't like, but for which there are no solutions. So the weather, is a condition. The weather can cause problems, obviously, as we're seeing in LA and other parts of the world, climate change and what have you. But in and of itself, the weather is not something we can really solve or control very readily. And I think in some situations, anxiety is just a condition. And as I would tell my clients, it's part of the deal. If you're going to be trying out for the school play, you're going to be anxious.
Mhm.
If you're, getting ready to take a big exam, if you watch your child drive off for the first time by themselves right after they got their driver's license, you're going to be very anxious. It's part of the deal. But when we start seeing anxiety as a problem per se, even though anxiety can cause problems in the sense of keeping us from doing what we need to do, I think it helps just recognize that, yeah, of course I'm anxious. I'm in a situation that would make anybody feel anxious.
Mhm.
And so the question is, how do I cope with that?
And I guess that's the piece, isn't it? That when you care about something, you will have fears and worries. Like as a parent, we care deeply about our children's well being, and therefore we will worry for them, whether it's, when they go on camp, whether it's when they're sick, whether it's when they get their driver's license. I can't bear the thought. The problem is that we care about them. Otherwise, we wouldn't feel anxiety. And I guess, like you said, that's a condition of being a parent, that we will feel anxiety for our children. And I think it gets even more complicated when our children feel anxiety themselves. Like
Oh,
that's
yeah,
even
it's
harder.
contagious.
It's contagious. Yeah. We feel even more worried for their well being. And with some individuals, like when we think about anxiety, we often think about temperament too. Some people are more predisposed to being anxious, and any parent can spend a lot of time in our arms, and those children are more predisposed to be anxious. So I think temperament is an important piece to recognize. Like you said, perhaps one of the conditions of our children, if they are of a temperament that they're more sensitive, may be anxiety, that they will be
Sure.
more likely to have it.
Yeah, the shy child with the tendency to be more withdrawn, particularly in novel situations. But we like to say that temperament is tendency, not destiny.
Yes.
So one of the things that I like to do is educate parents and their children about, okay, this is your temperament. This is your biological wired in personality style. And, some situations in life are going to ask you to override your tendency to stretch a little bit. And for the exuberant child, that means chill out a little bit and sit on your little carpet square in circle time and not bug the kid next to you. But that's hard for some kids because of their temperament. Other kids, it's the opposite, where they have to step up in situations that are making them anxious. And by recognizing our tendencies, we can see them as they begin to appear, and we can have strategies for overriding that tendency when the situation calls for it.
And I guess that's where, as parents, we can support our children if they have these tendencies that you could probably see from a fairly young age.
Hmm.
Like I'm thinking of, I do think part of the reason why we are more anxious than we were is that we get a lot of messages about how dangerous the world is. Like social media can bombard us with these messages. And that creates more anxiety in us as parents. And inadvertently, we tend to be more controlling of our children. And I wonder if that's also impacting their anxiety. So if we see our child has a tendency to be a little bit shyer, a little bit more tentative, we may tend to want to protect them more than our more exuberant child.
Right. The exuberant child, we have to admonish them not to be, leaping off the roof of the house with a sheet to see if it works as a parachute. So they get you in other ways. But one of my favorite authors is Wendy Mogul, who wrote a book
Mhm.
called The Blessing of a Skinned Knee. And it's all about not overprotecting your child. And, I think kids get the message that the world is a dangerous place when we keep asking them, Are you feeling anxious? Are you, how did it go at school today? Mogul talks about interviewing for pain. The child gets into the car at pickup time at the end of the school day, and the parent immediately launches into, did anybody have lunch with you today? Did anybody play with you at recess? And giving the child the idea that, that the world is fraught with all these, difficult and painful and anxiety provoking situations. I've done this myself. And of course, you want to know what's going on with your child so that you can be helpful if possible. But it does send the message that there is something to be anxious about. And Lord knows there are things to be anxious about. But we just have to be
Mm.
careful with that information that we give to our children and that we consume ourselves. I mean, all the stuff that we get, the evening news or wherever, it's probably not very helpful.
And it's great to think about the impact of our anxiety on our children. Like if we are concerned, so I guess it's important to distinguish when anxiety becomes problematic because anxiety is part of our journey as a parent and also it'll be part of our children's journey. In fact, I can't remember the name, but there is a condition where people don't experience anxiety and they tend to not live very long. Like anxiety is important to our survival. It's sort of
Oh,
like you
yeah.
said, baked in. So experiencing anxiety is part of the journey. And I was listening to a conversation on a podcast recently how, you know, there's a word for sadness and there's a word for depression, but there isn't another word for anxiety. It's all anxiety. So it sometimes is hard to know problematic anxiety from anxiety just is. And I think perhaps thinking about whether anxiety, our children's anxiety, is getting in the way of their life. Like they're consistently missing out on play dates or sleepovers, or their anxiety is having an impact on our life where we're having to accommodate by driving them to school and that taking us an extra hour to get to work, or I guess it's when anxiety is taking up too much space in our lives or our children's life that we need to start to think about how to support our child, whether it's at home or with additional help.
Sure. It's for me, it's to what extent are the anxious thoughts and feelings interfering with the child or the parent, any adult, interfering with their ability to do age appropriate and necessary tasks. Like, at some point, depending on what's, family traditions, most kids learn to sleep on their own. They learn
Mm.
to, go to school and deal with everything there. They go off to university, whatever it may be. And if you just have the feeling as a parent that all his peers are doing these X, Y, and Z things, and he's not, and he's been blaming or I'm blaming anxiety on it, then it's getting in the way. Then it becomes an impediment to living a full values based life. But I would actually disagree that we don't have more words for anxiety. In fact, I should mention to our listeners that Emma and I have some books coming out this spring. The first one being on anxiety, which is coming out in the end of March. And in it, we do talk about a lot of different words for anxious and nervous feelings, trepidation. And I even came across the word
Sure.
fantods, which is an old word meaning
Yes.
a case of the willies, like, whoa, that one look at that roller coaster gave me a case of the fantods. But, there's shadings of anxiety. You
Mm,
know, there's being pensive, and then there's being, then it shades into fear, which is a more physiological here and now, feeling of, impending doom or, terror or things like that. So one of the ways that we can help our kids is to, give them some good vocabulary around their emotions so that they can
mm.
actually see the shades of difference between being nervous and being terrified.
And I
And
guess as
so,
parents, we need those words too. Actually, that's
oh yeah,
true. That part in the book is really helpful because it lists all these, and some of, like you said, some of the words that we wouldn't use in our day to day language, but is important because it's more nuanced. And as parents, we can start introducing different words and not just anxiety.
When, the child says, I'm too scared to go to school, the parent might say, huh, so what's making you nervous? To maybe get at, well, we have a test today, or I'm worried that nobody's going to play with me at recess. And you say, oh, okay, well, maybe we can talk about that, come up with some strategies for handling that. But the book is called Just in Case Sits with Anxiety. And Emma came up with the main character's name, Just in Case, which was brilliant. It's on Amazon for pre-order, or you
Yes.
can order it directly from Jessica Kingsley Publishers.
Yes. And actually, it's got, I think we first came up with the idea 12 years ago. I remember
Really?
very well because it was when
Took them that
my
long to write it.
I think, yeah, it's been in the back burner since then. Because obviously, both you and I work with a lot of anxiety. It's something that, like you said, is baked in to being human. So knowing how to navigate it with more skill, um, is really important, really helpful. And as parents, it's very difficult to see our child experiencing any emotion, but especially anxiety, and not want to make it better. And so this piece around accommodation, I think, is really important, and how we as parents can sometimes accommodate to our children's anxiety. And a little bit of accommodation is okay. And by accommodation, we mean trying to reduce their anxiety. So we might accommodate by driving them to school if they don't want to take the bus, or, taking a different route because they're scared of dogs.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the two main ways that anxiety can present themselves behaviorally, where things really become problematic, is either avoidance of things that they need to engage in, or trying to control things that really, can't be controlled. And so they might say, I don't want to go to school today. Please don't let me go to school, which is both avoiding school and also trying to control the parent to get the parent to be okay with them not going to school. But kids might try to control peers on a play date because it makes them anxious. The uncertainty of knowing what we're going to play on the play date is anxiety provoking. So I've got the play date planned exactly how it's going to
Mm.
go. And then when my buddy comes over and he doesn't want to do what I want to do, then, my anxiety is even doubled or tripled. And so I try to control him and persuade him that, we need to do it my way. So if your parent is recognizing, a lot of avoidance of things that the child needs to do, and again, not everybody has to try out for the school play or go skydiving, but just certain typical, necessary things the kids need to do. We need to lean on them a little bit and, obviously give them strategies for being successful. Maybe even role play a little bit. Okay, let's role play talking, inviting another child at recess to play with you. If the worry is about nobody's going to play with me at recess. So we have to equip our kids with the tools to be able to manage these situations and to encourage them to get out there and do that. One of my favorite quotes is from a psychologist, O.H. Maurer, who was around in the 50s. And he said, I can act my way into feeling better sooner than I can feel my way into acting better.
Such a good
And
quote.
I really like that quote. And
Mm.
it's when we talk about exposure therapy for phobias and things like that, that's what we're talking about is like maybe not going off the high dive right away, but getting your toe in the water and then, maybe up to your knees or whatever, but gradually getting out there and doing the things that you need to do. And then lo and behold, 99 times out of 100, it's okay. That worked out. I didn't die. I didn't get humiliated. Maybe I can try that again. But yeah, it's tough because our brains are just like worry machines. They just crank out these stories about, how terrible it's going to be. And we believe it because it's our own brain telling us. So it's a trusted source.
Yeah, and I guess for our children and for ourselves, I think having clarity as to why it's important to have the sleepover or to go on the school bus, having clarity of, you know, the bottom line. Why are we doing this?
Right.
Helps us to have the willingness because anxiety feels deeply uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
It's supposed to feel deeply
it's
uncomfortable. Yeah.
supposed to
I mean,
feel
if anxiety was pleasant, we would have died out as a species a long time ago.
you're
And for some
right.
people, jumping out of a perfectly good airplane is like a great experience. That sort of like adrenaline rush for some people is they pay good money to do that. But I think for most of us, anxiety is an unpleasant, emotion that we would like to avoid if at all possible. But I think you're right. I mean, orienting, your child or ourselves to the bigger picture, to the valued goal that we're moving toward can give us, that willingness to push on through and get to the goal. But that's tricky.
It is tricky. And I think as parents, if we're watching our child who is really upset and, for example, doesn't want to go to school, we have to manage our own anxiety about their anxiety first, don't we, really?
Oh
We
yeah.
need to really have the eye on the kind of world we want for our kid. And if what we want for them is greater independence, um, greater autonomy, then we have to be willing to feel our own feelings, our own worries in the service of giving them a life that has more autonomy.
Hmm.
It's
And
a
that's a great
journey.
opportunity for the parent to model, not so much anxiety management, because we're not managing the anxiety per se. We're not trying to control it, because good luck with that. But managing our response to the anxious situation. So that would be the time for the parent to take an obvious deep breath, what I call coping out loud, to be able to say, whoa, you're really anxious about going to school. I'm really anxious about you being anxious. So let's think about this for a second. Well, gosh, school is really important and you got your friends and they're waiting for you. And I know, because we've talked about this, that 5 minutes after you're there, everything's fine. So let's head toward the door. But you're being, compassionate and you're validating their emotion and you're maybe giving them a little nuanced vocabulary while you're moving them in the direction of growth. But it
Yeah.
is an opportunity for the parent to cope out loud and say, yeah, this is really uncomfortable. And we got things we need to do.
And what's the acronym? We have it in the book, don't we? It's at the end to help
Sober.
parents cope. Sober, yeah. Where we help parents to really anchor in the moment. So talk us through that acronym. How do we
The acronym is
sober?
SOBER, and it was developed by a psychologist, Alan Marlatt, here at the University of Washington in Seattle. And the S, it's SOBER, and the S stands for stop. So you're
Mm.
confronted with a challenging situation, you're feeling panicky, you're about to react as opposed to respond to the situation. So you stop just for a second. The O is observe. Observe what's going on. What's going on with my child right now? Okay, he's really anxious. What's going on with me right now? I'm starting to get anxious. I'm starting to time travel. I'm starting to think, how's he ever going to go off to university on his own if he can't, like, go to second grade? B is breathe. You take a deep breath. So you've already kind of stepped back a little bit by doing the observing thing. So you're getting a little distance from the emotions. They're still there, but you're a little okay. You take that deep breath, buys you a little time. And then the E is expand. And the expand is there because when we get stressed out, we tend to do what I call the tube view. where we
Mm.
get this narrow focus. It's like, oh my gosh, my child is really anxious right now. I'm really anxious. I want to just terminate both our anxious states. So I'm going to let him like stay home from school, which would feel great. That's what we
Mm.
call negative reinforcement because I've just reinforced both of our behaviors, his leading and my giving in. That's probably not the wisest choice. But so when we expand, we get away from this tube view to say, okay, what's the bigger picture here? Okay, yes, we're all feeling anxious and we got to get this kid to school. And so the R is respond. So we respond to the situation, which is a little different from reacting. It's a little more, probably no less, anxious, certainly, because that's not going to go away anytime soon. It may not even be very calm. I think calm is overrated. Um, And it's invalidating if you're too calm when you say, I
Mm.
understand you're upset. It's like you have to be able to go, whoa, I can see you're really anxious. We got to get to school, So you put a little affect behind it, and it lets the person know that you get it at a real, visceral level. So you stop, you observe what's going on, you take that deep breath, you expand, or if things are getting too crazy and you're worried about him going off to university in like 12 years, you kind of contract, you bring it in, but contract messes up the acronym, so I left it out. And then you respond. And very often your first best response is some sort of validation where you play the child back in some, meaningful way saying, I get it, you're feeling X. You want to do Y, you need to do Z. What are we going to do? So then you do a little parental aikido and you try to like move the child in the good direction. And and some days you just say, fine, we're not going to school today. We'll just sit here and enjoy ourselves. But tomorrow we're going. But that's a tricky trap, and tomorrow's going to be another painful day. But I don't blame parents if they just cave, because it's hard. And kids can be relentless.
I
Absolutely.
think, yeah, lots of compassion for parents who have to navigate these challenging moments. But that's a brilliant acronym. And I know that we go through that really carefully in the book, because it is so important for parents to know how to regulate their own emotions because they will be triggered, and feel quite distressed, as we
Hmm.
should do. We should
Right.
feel distressed when our children feel distressed. It's
Oh yeah. I
um,
mean, good parents are going to resonate with how their child is feeling.
mm,
It's part of, I think, what makes human connection possible. You mentioned before that some parents don't get anxious about their kids, but those aren't particularly good parents, in my
yeah.
opinion. But, this does get to, resilience and parent resilience and self care and all that sort of thing. And I'm
Mm.
sure I've mentioned this before that my favorite definition of resilience is struggling well, which
Yes.
again goes back to the
Such a good
idea of,
one.
this is a condition, this is part of the deal. And struggling is part of family life. And, you know, I used to say, if having problems as a family is a problem, you have a big problem. Because family life is full of problems. Like almost every day, there's a problem to be solved or a condition to be, coped with. That's exhausting.
It is exhausting. And that's why having clarity on what's important helps. Like knowing, for example, that, we want our child to have an education, or we want them to have active social life, or we want to have, we want to pursue a career, or we want to, develop, I don't know, run a marathon, whatever it might be, that we have clarity on those pieces that are really important will help us navigate some of this sort of stormy weather. Because in the moment, it can be really difficult not to be reactive, like you were saying, and be responsive. Like it takes a lot of skill to keep your eye on what truly matters in that moment. And being a parent, I remember you saying to me very early on, in sort of after I had graduated, that it's not about being your kid's best friend. Like there are many moments as a parent that we have to make difficult decisions, and that what we say and what we do may not make them happy and may
Oh,
not
yeah.
be the
It
thing they
may
want.
infuriate them.
Yeah, fairly regularly.
We get the
And
"I hate you."
I hate you. Oh gosh. Yeah. In writing. Of late, I've been getting it in writing just to make it more.
Well, my son used to say, "I'm gonna be picking your nursing home."
That is quite dark.
It's chilling, yeah.
I think I think it's important because, of course, we want our children to like us all the time, ideally love us all the time, but doesn't come with, the journey of a parent. The journey of the parent means that, our child will dislike us. And that may be the most important thing we need to do in the moment, even if they're really unhappy.
Yeah, but like you said, it's in the context of having clarity, and if there's multiple parents, parenting partners or whatever, to make sure that there's good communication around these things. Like, what is important to us as a family? What are sort of our bottom line expectations and values? And how do we do that? And again, you wouldn't do this with a 3-year-old, but with a 14-year-old, you might have some discussion around this and say, okay, how are we going to do this? You want to do X? I need you to do Y. Let's negotiate. And that's an important life skill and an opportunity to model communication and to help the child develop some skills around give and take and, compromising and, you know, keeping an eye on, the valued goals at the same time and not just reacting to what would feel good in the moment.
To help them navigate their anxiety too. Like, if I think of our just going back to the workbook and how we can teach them certain language, the different words for anxiety, but also to recognize that anxiety is often stories, stories that we have, be it as parents or be it our children, about a situation or ideas. And I really like that concept, the concept of an idea and whether that idea is useful or not in the service of that bigger picture that we were just talking about. And I guess even as parents, this idea that our children need to like us all the time, how useful is that in the service of, getting them to school or getting them to do chores, which is a big part of my day to day. They don't want to do it and they're not particularly happy, but I think it's really important for them to learn about responsibility. That doesn't go without a few battles.
No, of course not. But again,
Um,
it's in the context of your value of saying, my children are going to learn responsibility and thoughtfulness. They're going to do it through chores because that's one of the best way to contribute to the family.
it's true. It is true that giving our kids, supporting our kids to grow and develop in ways that we think are important requires us being comfortable with difficult feelings, both our own and theirs, in the service of what's really important. And I think anxiety comes into it because sometimes they have to do things that give them a lot of anxiety, like you were saying, sitting tests, going to school, um, peers, having to go to because as they get older, their anxieties can be around their friendships.
It's tricky, and this is perhaps another conversation. I remember the quote from the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung, who said, "The most important influence on the life of a child is the life his parent never led." So, are we pushing our child into, football or the school play or getting their Eagle Scout thing because it's best for them, or it's because it's like, they're living out our fantasy or our ideas of what their life should be? That's a whole nother topic, but it's just, it's one of those tricky things about being a parent that you have to keep your eye on all of these stories and these ideas that we have and not to take them too seriously, particularly if they're not working out very well in the life of the
Such a
family.
good point. Such a good point because we are in this environment. what you said at the beginning, that, there's a lot of anxiety out there that our children need to be successful. This overachievement culture, this toxic striving, and we're going to have a conversation about that on the podcast, is a problem for us as parents and for our children, that we fear that they're not going to have the success that they should have and they need to have. And that means that we can push them in directions that maybe they don't need to go. And that
Yeah,
maybe anxiety is coming from their inability to do the things as opposed to their fear about doing the things. Like sometimes I
right.
wonder if, as parents, when our children is anxious, it's because they don't have the coping skills that they need, or it's not, appropriate for them. I do think our expectations are going up of our children. I remember
Absolutely.
talking
Absolutely.
about that with Debbie Sorensen, that, when I hear parents taking their 3-year-olds to 5 sessions of football a week and then they wonder why the kid is feeling overwhelmed. I'm thinking, because they're going to football 5 times a week. Why would you do that to yourself, let alone to your child? But I do think we have to be constantly on the lookout for our expectations of ourselves and our children, because those have skyrocketed.
We need to take a step back,
Yeah, I think so too. And that's not anxiety per se. That might just be that developmentally it's not appropriate.
or it doesn't match the child's temperament.
Yeah, it's so true. And that's where knowing our kids and knowing ourselves is important, being really attuned. Yeah. And that's what we learn as parents. But keeping an eye on things, like holding things lightly, like you just said, Chris, is very important. Like, don't take our thoughts too seriously, our ideas too seriously, keeping an eye on how things are really working,
Yeah, to be curious, to,
to be
to say, huh,
curious.
I wonder if that's true. How can I find out? And, we usually find out by engaging rather than, trying to figure it out ahead of time. I could act my way into feeling better sooner than I can feel or think my way into acting better.
Really helpful. So I think we've done a brilliant job of, may I say,
Yes, please.
yeah, of talking about parental anxiety and childhood anxiety. And obviously, I've learned so much about this from you, Chris, and your years of experience. And I've really enjoyed writing the workbook just in case sits with anxiety.
And the two more that are coming out,
Oh yes,
one on sadness and one
yeah,
on anger, which will be coming out in May and July, respectively. So we'll have all that in the show notes.
brilliant. Yeah, because anxiety sometimes can show up as anger. We can get, quite
Oh,
angry.
certainly oppositional behavior, because child doesn't, it's fight or flight. So they're going to fight you on going to school, or they're going to like run off and hide under the bed or whatever. But yeah, it can show up as attention concentration problems because they're in their head worrying about something and they're not paying attention to you or the teacher or whatever. There's a lot of what we call comorbidity between ADHD and anxiety because they all
Hmm.
come from basically the same part of the brain, which is central to attention allocation. So, yeah, there's a lot of ways anxiety can present itself. So, looking at the child's behavior patterns and how much fight or flight or control or avoidance is going on, and how much is that impacting the child's development and having a good life.
And our own.
Right. And our
Yeah.
own.
Because as parents, it will influence us immensely. Wonderful. Any parting final thoughts? This is my turn to say it.
Just keep breathing. It's anxiety is a fact of life and it's a fact of many important situations if we're living, an interesting life, and it needn't get in the way if we can handle it well and keep our eye on the prize.
Beautiful. So true. It needn't be the boss of us. Love that.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you, Emma. This was a lot of fun.
It really was.
Thanks so much for tuning into the Life's Dirty Little Secrets podcast.
If you have any feedback for us or secrets for future episodes,
You can email us at lifesdirtylittlesecretspodcast@gmail.com.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Life's Dirty Little Secrets or on Facebook at Life's Dirty Little Secrets Podcast.
We invite you to follow, rate, and review us on wherever you listen to this podcast. It is the best way to get our podcast out in front of new listeners.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks with more.
See you then.